Hello and welcome to this data service instructional video. During this video, we are actually going to go over standards and reporting categories. So we're going to take a look at the standards and the reporting categories. Some of the goals for this particular video are to distinguish the difference between and the purpose for reporting categories and standards. We're going to identify how each is calculated, and identify what is used to generate scores for standards and for the reporting category. So we're going to take a look at those two things, and we're going to take a look at all of the little pieces that make up reporting categories and standards and how they are graded and all those things. A quick note, no reporting system should ever be a substitute for good parent contact or for student work. So while the grades are presented here, it's always good to hold some student work to use as a to support for your grades. And it's also always good to have other means of contact with your parents, teacher. So, all right, with that said, we are going to move forward. Okay. Reporting categories. So what a reporting category is in the system is it's a high level view of how students are performing on a set of similar or related standards. So like your all the standards that are clustered together using the through the Common Core, a lot of times those clusters will be considered the reporting category. And the purpose of the reporting category is just to have a general overview of student progress for each of those clusters. So it gives you an idea of how the student is progressing in that specific cluster to date. To calculate a reporting category, all the standards in the reporting category that have been assessed are averaged, and then they generate a score. If a student has not been assessed on one of the standards in that reporting category, that standard is not included in the average. So if a student has been assessed on a standard, it doesn't come up as a 0, it just isn't included in the average. So scores can fluctuate throughout the year. And of course, all standards aren't assessed at every marking period. So there are going to be times when some standards are not assessed during the year and others are. Let's take a look at what it actually looks like and dig into how a student's grade is actually affected. All right, this is a student detail page for second grade. If you take a look at this student detail page, this is identical to what's on a student's report card. So, or the student progress report. So you'll see on the left here, this is the donut. It gives you an idea of standard progress throughout the year. So there are 68 standards for ELA in second grade that are being addressed. And currently this student's been assessed on 26 out of 38 standards. So they've been evaluated for 26 out of 38 of the standards here. You'll see also that this student has a little red on their donut. That means that there are a few standards that are limited progress, and that's okay. Even though that limited progress is not coming up here, it means that those other standards in that reporting category are probably pulling that student's grade up some. So if you take a look at the reporting categories, you'll see that there are several headers here. We've got reading, speaking and listening, writing, language, and then the bottom of your learning behaviors. And in each of those headers, underneath of them are the reporting categories. So for reading, you have 4 reporting categories. They're phonics and word recognition, fluency, literacy comprehension, and informational comprehension. We're going to take a look specifically at literacy comprehension. So you can see that this student has, for literacy comprehension, they've been assessed 12 times. They have had 12 items have been used to assess the student. And they have a progress of 2.66, which makes them meeting proficiency currently on this specific standard. So let's dig in a little bit deeper. And if you are a teacher and you're watching this video, you can always click on the standard details below this. There's a little drop down, and it'll drop down into all of the reporting categories broken up by standards. I'm going to look specifically at the literacy comprehension reporting category. All right, so you can see here, this is the literacy comprehension category for reading. I've brought in the student's current score or proficiency. So they're meeting proficiency 2.66. And then here are the raw scores that the student has. So the student's been assessed 2 times on RL1, asking and answering questions. They've been assessed 4 times on RL3, describe how characters in a story respond to major events. They've been assessed 2 times on RL4. They've been assessed 2 times on RL5, and they've been assessed 2 times on RL7. So you can see that this student's already proficient in 3 of these standards, it looks like. Even though they've only been assessed 2 times, they are currently proficient. So what I've done here at the bottom is and when I scroll down there, it hides it. Let's see if it'll come back up. There we go. So I've taken the 5 standards and I've shown how they calculate the actual score for the reporting category literacy comprehension. So there's 5 standards. The student has a 2, a 2.29, a 3, a 3, and a 3. If you add all those up, you get 13.29. And if you divide them by 5, you get 2.658, which rounds up to 2.66. So the student's current score is meeting proficiency 2.66. Now, the reason that the student's score is not, the power law is not used at this level is because these standards may be addressed at different parts of the year. So right now, this teacher has not evaluated RL2 recount stories. So we don't want any of these standards to weigh heavier than any other standard. So if let's say that these were all assessed in the first marking period, but in the 4th marking period, I assess RL22 and I'm using the power law, because the power law takes into consideration when something is assessed, this standard would hold more weight. But we're not using the power law here. We're using a regular average at this particular place. So when we formulate a score, when we calculate a score for the reporting category, we are using an average. All right. So you can see that each of these have a different amount of assessments for each of them, which is totally fine because each of these things is considered a specific, the scores for that specific standard. So if a student is assessed 3 times on RL4 or 4 times and they're proficient and they seem to be proficient, you know they're proficient. As a teacher, you're like, you know what? I know that they describe how words and phrases supply rhythm and meaning in a story, poem, or song. They're nailing it. I don't need to go back necessarily and assess that as frequently. But if the student is having a hard time describing how characters in a story respond to major events and challenges, which the student seems to be struggling a little bit, well then in that case, I should probably go back and take a look at that student's score. So when a parent asks, what should my student be working on? This would be a good place to go to and take a look at the standards that student is actually struggling with. And then you can give specific instances and support that with any student work that you have. And let's take a look. And here's how the reporting categories are rounded. So meets proficiency, these are all rounded on a standard round. So 0 to 1.49 is limited progress, if that's what a student has. Progress towards proficiency is 1.5 to 2.49. And then meets proficiency is 2.5 to anything above, which the scale really only goes to 3 basically. So that 4 is incorrect, but if you're in Colonial, it will be a 4. Since you're in Red Clay, if you're in Red Clay, it's a 3. So, and that's basically how this score is generated. So, and of course, these scores here, for the teacher view, you only see progress towards proficiency. You don't always see these, you can't always see these numbers, the raw scores. There's a little button that I can click that gives me the raw scores here. So for the purpose of this video, we're showing the raw scores to get down into the nitty gritty. All right. So for the standards view, so for standards, it's a detailed view of how standards or our student is performing on the specific standard, and it's based off of a mastery model. So what the system is really looking at is that student mastering the standard that is an end of the year standard. So we're looking at end of the year standards for 2nd grade in this video. Has the student mastered that standard yet? The purpose for this particular, the standards view, is to help guide instruction, just like we kind of talked about a minute ago. So you're going to use those standards to help guide instruction, to inform parents, to let them know of any holes that the student might have, and and move forward with that knowledge in mind. To calculate, the assessments are tied to a specific standard, and then when there's more than one score present for a standard, the power law is used to calculate. So with a single score, we just take that score. So if a student has a 3, we just take the 3. But if a student has more than one score, we take whatever scores are present and we put them into the power law calculation. All right, strap in. We're going to take a look at it. So we're going to use literacy comprehension again. This is the exact same reporting category we were looking at, these are the exact same standards. And we're going to take a look at this, describes how characters in a story respond to major events and challenges. Because this is a standard we talked about before. And as you can see, this student has a progress towards proficiency, which is 2.29, and they've been assessed 4 times on that standard. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into this specific standard. And if you're a teacher watching this video, you can select the 4, or if you're on the parent portal, you can also click on the underlined 4, and it will take you to these assessments, and you can see what assessments were used to generate this or to calculate this score. So let's take a look. All right. Once you click on that 4, it'll drill down to the standards. So you'll see we're still on RL23. Describe how characters in a story respond to major events and challenges. So there have been 4 assessments used to calculate this score. Here are the 4 assessments. And then here's a quick graph of what the power law looks like. So you'll see the student got a 3, then they got a 2.6, a 1.67, and another 3. So over here, we can see also how many questions were on each assessment. So this first assessment, there was 1 question that was made up of. The second assessment, there were 5. The third assessment, there were 3. And then this fourth assessment, there was 1. So, and then you can also look at the dates and see which assessment was the most recent. So you can see that this 11/29 was the last time the student was assessed. So down below, if you can see that there are 4 scores here, and I've run the average again. So if I were to take these scores and average them, the student would have a 2.57. But right now, the power law says they have a 2.29, which is why I chose this specific student. Now, this doesn't happen all that frequently, but it will happen occasionally. So what's happened here is that the power law is adaptive and it looks at trends. So if you look at this graph or this line, trending line, this student's grade is trending down. So the power law believes that this student, it's supposed to be calculating ahead, like what is the student likely to get next? So in this particular situation, it thinks that the student's probably trending down, and it's possible that the student won't get as high a score as the average would be. So in a case like this, it looks like the average is higher than the power law, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's detrimental to the student's score, because right now the student would be in the same place whether they had a 2.57 or a 2.29. The difference is that the power law is much more reactive. So as a student gets another green, it's going to come up quicker than it would if it was just an average. And we'll look at that here in a second. So let's take a look at the next slide. All right, so here's the power law. A lot of people have asked, what is the power law? Here's a copy of the equation. If you are really into math, you can feel free to break this down. This power law, the formula, and a little bit of description can be found in both of these books. These are 2 of the some of the research we used to develop this program. So Transforming Classroom Grading and Developing Standards-Based Report Cards, Guskey and Bailey, and Marzano on the other end here. So these are 2 great books. If you want to know anything or a little bit more about it, I would encourage you to take a look at these 2 books. They are very informative. All right. Moving forward. Okay, so what is the power law? We've seen it. What does it mean? So the important thing to remember is that it weighs the most recent assessments heavier. So the more recent assessments, it's going to weigh them a little bit heavier. It operates on the concept of a natural learning curve. So what the power law thinks is most likely the most recent student is going to be the smartest student. So a student today hopefully is smarter than they were yesterday and the day before that. So it takes that into consideration. That's why it's weighting the more recent scores heavier. So it's predictive. It's actually trying to predict what the student's next score will be. So it's trying to predict the future in a sense. It's saying, well, we know that the student is trending this way, so let's take a look and wonder, has the student mastered this standard, or does the student need a little bit more encouragement? And it's dynamic. Every time a new assessment is put in, it takes a look at it recalculates using all of the previous assessments. So it takes a look historically back at all the assessments and it recalculates. And we're going to get into the weeds a little bit in the next slide, and I think that it may help you see how it recalculates, possibly. All right, this is a spreadsheet that is set up as a gut check to make sure that the power law is calculating correctly and to see how the power law actually functions. So you'll see that this is actually the scores from the previous student. So the student had a 3, a 2.6, a 1.67, and a 3. So currently the student score stops at this 4 because they've only been assessed 4 times. What I did is I put 2 more assessments in because the most frequently asked question that I receive from parents and teachers is, how many more scores will it take for the power law to readjust? How many more scores do I need to put in for this student to be proficient or for their grade to go up to the next level? So in this case, the student got, and it's different in every case. And I'm not saying that there's a specific amount that you need to assess, but I thought that this visual might help answer some questions about how the power law functions. A student is proficient when they're proficient, correct? So this is not meant to say when a student is proficient, the system does that on its own. This is meant to help you see how the power law actually reacts when grades are put into them. So you'll see that this student, the last score that they got, the fourth assessment was a 3. If the student got 2 more 3s, the average would be almost identical to this the power law. So the power law at 6. So if I had 6 assessments, and after that 4th one I got 2 proficients, a 3 and a 3, this student would have a 2.7 for the power law and a 2.71 for the average. So what happens from now on out, after my 7th assessment, the power law will be significantly higher than the actual average. So it takes like 1 or 2 assessments for the power law to swing above the average, if that makes sense. So this has been a question from several people. And the reason we use it is because of this, because of the fact that it adapts quicker. So if a student is getting proficiency, it swings that student's grade up quicker. And the reason we want that is because we've seen in the past that students can be buried under zeros, basically. So what will happen is if a student is not proficient, and then all of a sudden they start understanding the content, which if as a teacher, I've seen it happen. I'm sure all teachers have seen this happen. All of a sudden, a light bulb goes off and the student understands something or they're starting to grasp the concept. But unfortunately, because of the grades sometimes or because of an average, that student can be buried underneath of the past work. And that's not what we want. So the power law allows the student's grade to adapt quicker and allows them to the score to adjust according to the student's progress when they suddenly understand a concept. So that's why we use the power law specifically for this program versus an average, because it is all the research says that it's a better representation of how a student performs in a classroom than a regular average. And of course, there is no mathematical equation that is perfect for student grades, right? We all know that every student is different and that sometimes scores can fluctuate. But this is the best indicator mathematically, as far as the research says, to indicate how a student usually does in class. So, and there are a few ways that, that you can always take a look at your scores and see, where a student, again, no program is a supplement for really digging in and taking a look at student work. So no grading book. All right, so let's take a look. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. So for the standard, at the standard level, and remember, we're just talking about this standard, one standard right now. The rounding starts at 0.75. So 0 to 1.74 is limited progress. Progress towards proficiency for the standard is 1.75 to 2.74, and meets proficiency is 2.75 to 3.75 or 4. And again, the reason for this is because it's a mastery model. We don't want students to fall through the cracks at the standard level because they got close enough. We want to make sure that that student is actually mastering that specific standard. So that's why we round up at the 0.75. Because if we rounded at 5, the student still might not have enough knowledge in that specific standard to move forward. And if we're rounding at 2.75, we can say, well, we're more confident at this point that the student is able to master the standard or is progressing towards proficiency. And again, this is a growth model. These are end of the year standards. So keep that in mind as you go through and you're taking a look at your student work. All right, the assessment of a standard. So we're actually going to look at the standard and how they are assessed. The assessment of a standard. So scores at the assessment level are tied to a specific standard. So every district created assessment that's put into the system has a standard that's related to it. If a standard is assessed more than one time on a single assessment, the score for that standard on that assessment is average. So this is confusing, right? So sometimes there might be 5 questions that address one single standard. So it's going to take a look at all 5 of those questions and it's going to find the average of the score for those 5 questions. And we'll take a look at that. And a single assessment is considered a single example of a student's ability. So one assessment is one data point. So while I give an assessment, if I have 5 questions that speak to a standard on one assessment, all 5 of those questions are going to be chunked together and considered a single data point for that student. And we'll take a look and dig in here in a second. All right, so we're back to RL23. Describe how characters in a story respond to major events and challenges. All right, so we're actually going to take a look at this second assessment here, number 2, Snowshoe Hare's Winter Home Part 1. And I believe this is a teacher-created assessment. So we're going to take a look at it. This student received a 2.6 on this assessment, and they have progress towards proficiency because they did not get 2.75. If the student had a 2.75, it would be rounding the score up. All right, so if we take a look at this particular score, and you can see here, this student was assessed on RL3 5 times on this assessment. So on this assessment, questions 11 through 15, the student was assessed on RL3. And you can see that they got a 3, a 3, a 1, a 3, a 3, right? That means that they got 13. So the student got 13 points divided by 5, so their average is 2.6. So we average at this level instead of using the power law because this is a single assessment and we can't consider time in it. So the power law has that time attribute to it, and because the power law looks at the most frequent score, or the last score as the heaviest weighted, we can't use the power law here. Because if we did that, question 15 would weigh more than question 11 because it was most likely the last score graded. So at this place, we when it's on an assessment, we take all of the student scores for that specific standard and we round them. And the student got a 2.6 on this particular assessment. And you can see that in this assessment, the student was graded on several other standards. It's just that they were graded 5 times on this specific standard. All right. Okay, so how does it all fit together? So we sort of work backwards through this. We started at the reporting category level. We came all the way down to the standard level. So if we work the other way, the teacher gives assessments that are tied to specific standards. Here are our assessments. If a standard is addressed by more than one question, the scores of the questions are averaged. So that's what we just looked at. Snowshoe Hare's Winter Home. 5 questions were for this specific standard. Those 5 questions were all averaged and the student got a 2.6. A score is then calculated for a standard using the power law. So the most recent assessment usually weighs the most, don't forget. And here's the power law. And it is adaptive, and it also looks at the trend that a student is going through. So remember, if a student is trending down, the power law is most likely to score that student. It might look a little lower than the average. If a student is trending up, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to look higher than the average. So keep that in mind. All right, like standards that have been assessed are then clustered, and a score is calculated at the reporting category level. So in this particular situation, we have literacy comprehension. We take a look over here. Here's literacy comprehension. Here are all of the standards that are in literacy comprehension. All of these fall under the umbrella. They're all of your RL standards. And you can see that for RL3 right here, this student has been assessed 4 times. So that speaks back to this. And the student only currently has 5 scores for this standard. So we are using 5 scores. We are rounding them. We're adding all 5 of those scores. We're rounding them, and we're finding the proficiency level for this specific standard. Now you'll see that as time goes on, these other standards will start to fill in as the year progresses, and the student's score might change, especially since in some cases you might be doing new work. So the first time you might address a skill, the student score might drop a little bit. So you want to keep that in mind as you go through. But the important part is that you can always come back to your standards view and take a look at what standards a specific student is struggling on, and work on those standards moving forward. All right, so hopefully this clarified some of your questions about standards and reporting categories. Hopefully the system is a little clear and how it functions now. If you have any questions, please reach out and let me know. Hopefully this helped to clarify things. And again, feel free to watch this video again if you'd like, and feel free to look at the system and play around with it. Don't forget, you can always go back and reassess a student and change that student's score at times, or you can reassess any standards that a student is struggling in as a teacher. So feel free to do those things. All right, thank you very much for watching. I'm sorry, I know this was a long one. All right, have a great day.